Joining me now is one of my favorite authors of two of my favorite all-time political books. And so it has meant that anything he does, I watch it, I read it. The guest is Greg Mitchell, historian, author, sort of really an expert on nuclear weapons, and has spent a large part of his career. He was the editor of the Nuclear Times at one point. In fact, we're going to be talking about a new documentary he has out called The Atomic Bowl, about this bizarre military organized U.S. occupation football game held basically within a few miles of ground zero in Nagasaki, Japan in 1946. And we're going to get into that bizarreness in a minute. But the two books, in case you're wondering, that that basically were very formative for me in many ways: Tricky Dick and the Pink Lady, about Richard Nixon's 1950 Senate campaign. I just think I've read it 3 times, and I always learned something more from it, Greg. And of course,
more than I've read it. Yes.
And Campaign of the Century, about Upton Sinclair's famous 1932 campaign for California governor. I think 32, right? If I have it.
34, yeah.
34, excuse me. And so, Greg knows how much I love those books, and he never, and if you subscribe to his Substack, you also know he's a great music historian as well. He loves his 60s rock and roll. And so there's so many places we could go, Greg, but let's start with, before we get to the specifics of the Atomic Bowl and all of that, explain your foray into the nuclear weapons arena. Like, what got you into this? Because you've been essentially, I'd say, one of the core reporters and historians on this for decades. What got you into it?
Well, thank you. Well, as an older person who grew up in the late 1950s and the mid 50s and the early 60s, I could hardly avoid the subject. From Duck and Cover in schools to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dr. Strangelove was my favorite movie from an early age. Mm-hmm. And then down through the early 1980s, when the great anti-nuclear movement, sparked by the so-called Freeze campaign, grew. I was hired as the editor of Nuclear Times, which was the Bible of the movement. So it's really been, how many years since then now?
About 40
years. Yeah. And I was, but the kind of a key turning point on the specific subject of the atomic bombings. Now, I've now written 4 books and directed 2 films for PBS on the subject and written hundreds of articles. But I got a journalism grant to go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1984 for a full month. Mm-hmm. Very rare for an American journalist to be able to spend that much time in those cities. To this day. And, part of it was a week in Nagasaki, which hardly anyone ever does. Yeah. And, I was just quite struck by how little was known about Nagasaki. They called it the Forgotten City when I was there. Yeah. The inferior A-bomb city, they referred to it, the Japanese themselves. Right. So I've gone out of my way in the last 40 years in many articles and books and so forth to talk about Nagasaki in some way. One way or another, and bring it more to attention, but it's still largely, I'm going to say, forgotten, overlooked today. And so I was happy to do this new film, The Atomic Bowl, and book. There's a companion book also called The Atomic Bowl. Finally, really focusing on Nagasaki.
The timing of this after Oppenheimer, it's got to be kind of helpful to bring a little bit more attention on the movie itself got mainstream attention. I was skeptical of how mainstream the movie was going to get. Right? We don't do, and look, it was just a well done movie, and it did capture the zeitgeist, at least to a degree. And I think sort of it is what's amazing is how little journalism was done about those two cities, right? Yeah. And you don't even to this day. I mean, walk me through it. Are there regular, to me, there should be a regular study of health outcomes from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a regular study of what's happening to the ecosystems, right? Yeah. A regular study. And it does feel as if the entire Western world, including Japan, just wants to sweep all of this under the rug.
Yeah, well, right from the start, and one of the points of the film, which I think is pretty wide ranging, is that the atomic bowl, which, as you say, was held on a killing field very near ground zero, actually in on the schoolyard of a middle school where 175 students and teachers have been killed by the atomic bomb. So, 4 months later, they're playing an all-star U.S. military football game on that field. And it was much celebrated at the time.
Was it 4 months later or 18 months later?
No, it was January 1st, 1946. And
it was January 1st, 46. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, and as you know, back then, the bowl games in the U.S., the college bowl games, were always played in January 1st. All those, the Sugar Bowl, Rose Bowl, all those bowls existed then. And they were played on January 1st. That was it. Didn't care what day of the week it was, know. And of course, that's been bastardized in recent years and decades. But back then, January 1st. So they had this all-star football game in Nagasaki outside the school on January 1st. So, of course, the media, I'm not sure it was the media or the military, dubbed it the Atomic Bowl. And right from the start. And it got a lot of publicity leading up to it, got a lot of coverage in the 2 days after, and then it was totally forgotten, totally overlooked. The media never returned to it, as if, I don't know, as if shame set in, maybe, or just.
Well, that's what it feels like. I love you chronicled. Wasn't until like the early 80s that a participant finally wrote about it. Like, there's no footage of this game, correct?
No, there's no footage. The only photos were taken by a few soldiers, and the hero of my film, who was a poet and professor and writer for the New Yorker, who was an observer, and he was given photos by a Japanese journalist who gave him the photos later. So a lot of the photos in the film come from him or from the National Archives, but there was no media coverage. There was nothing afterwards, after 2 days. It went into kind of a black hole in history, and whether we can talk about possible reasons for that, but so it's not as if this subject has been covered widely in the past, which I always love to do films or books about subjects where the person kind of says, "How come I don't know about this?" Or
100%.
This is mind-boggling. Why have I never heard of it? So that's kind of a through line for most of my books and films is an untold story, or largely untold story.
No, I mean, that's why I love your Nixon book. It's there's so much literature on Nixon. That Senate race was never written about in the way that, and yet I find it to be the single best book to understand the start of McCarthyism. I mean, you captured, right? You captured a moment, and frankly, it and Upton Sinclair's same thing, right? Where, this was one of those, you want to talk about ignorance. I had to read Upton Sinclair in high school, and I didn't realize he'd run for governor until I came across your book.
And gave birth to the first attack ads created Irving Thalberg. So.
Not to totally get off track here, because I want to stick to the nuclear story, but the beauty of both of your books is it's also a history of political consulting. And a history of sort of the modern political campaign was born in 1950, right? With helicopter, him barnstorming the state by helicopter. He hired paid political consultants, something that didn't happen. And of course, my favorite aspect of your book is Ronald Reagan supported the Democrat and Joe Kennedy supported the Republican.
That's right.
So it was like there was, up is down, left is right, cats and dogs living together. But so no, I mean, this is sort of your gift, right? Which is sort of surfacing something that an event everybody knows, maybe a person everybody knows, but boy, you didn't know this detail. And Nagasaki, and Oppenheimer, the movie gets into this a little bit. Kai Bird's book gets into it even more, which is, why was it bombed in the first place? Well, we made our point. Well, how is it that we didn't think we made the point with the first bombing?
Yeah. Well, even Oppenheimer, he does have Oppenheimer mention Nagasaki, I think, twice for about 10 seconds, where he just adds almost. I thought it almost was dubbed after the film was done, where suddenly
somebody mentioned, "Hey, you don't mention Nagasaki."
They're talking about Hiroshima, and he says, "And Nagasaki," almost like it was dubbed. But of course, that's my long-stand complaint about this issue. But Nagasaki to me has, as many lessons for us today as Hiroshima, which might surprise a lot of people for someone to say.
Aren't they the same lessons, or you think they're different?
Well, they're quite different, but the thing with Nagasaki was, one lesson is, most people don't know, it was kind of automated in a way. When Truman gave the order, it was, which was a few weeks earlier, was just, okay, use the atomic weapons when they're ready. And after Hiroshima, the Nagasaki bomb was ready 3 days later. Truman did not make a separate decision. General Leslie Groves, who's played by Matt Damon, the movie, a little more sympathetically than I would, took control. He basically, Truman was coming back from Potsdam, and basically Leslie Groves wanted to use all the weapons that we had from the Manhattan Project, and so he pushed for the Nagasaki bomb, sort of on his own. He I didn't need to hear from Truman on it. So it was largely
let me back up.
Can
you back up a second?
Okay.
Why were those two cities singled out? Why were they the ones to bomb?
Well, the target list came down to cities that had not been widely already bombed, which didn't leave that many.
Because Tokyo had been bombed like crazy, right?
Yeah. So there was there was some people wanted to bomb the Emperor's Palace, for example, in Tokyo, but Hiroshima was a very large city. It had a large military base, so it was largely not the military. And then Kokura was number 2 on the list, and Nagasaki was number 3. And on the day of the Nagasaki bombing, of course, Kokura was socked in by clouds, so they went on to Nagasaki. So Nagasaki was rather
basically it had bad because of a weather anomaly. Nagasaki gets bombed.
Yeah. But so Hiroshima. We could talk for days about this, so I don't want to boil it down too much. But Hiroshima, in both cases, the targets were the center of the cities, not the military. Hiroshima had a major military base, but the target was the center of the city, so that more people would be killed. Nagasaki, the same thing. The target was the middle of the city. Now, it happened in Nagasaki for various reasons, because it was also socked in by clouds, and they dropped the bomb anyway. And it landed more than a mile off target, directly over the Catholic community. So 15,000 Catholics died, biggest community in the Far East, because the bomb, they had to get rid of it. I kind of liken it to a drone. That's kind of in modern day, a drone is sent out, and it's sort of, okay, we're going to drop this payload no matter where it is. So that's the basic thing. Now you can say, why did they drop 2 bombs? And as I said, one reason was Truman had deferred to, in fact, when he came back from Potsdam, he was surprised that the second bomb had been used, and he immediately put a stop to any more weapons. So we had one more weapon, and we were going to have more, and he immediately put a stop to the use of any more. So, but as I said, this was an automated kind of system. Almost like AI had taken over. I make the points in the film about, the dangers of AI today, the dangers of the U.S. still having a first use policy to use nuclear weapons first, the dangers of having a president. And then it was Truman, who was not experienced. He had just become president after FDR died. Today you have Trump, whatever you think of him, the stability of the current president, having the ability, with the aid of AI, to launch a strike at any time. So there's just a lot of resonance and meaning, lessons, warnings from the atomic bombings 80 years ago. It's not just a interesting historical case. It's not just something you look at every year because it's kind of incredible history, but it's also very extremely relevant for today, or what might happen today.
Look, this podcast is going to drop, I think, on the anniversary of Hiroshima, right? The 6th is Hiroshima.
Yep.
The 9th is Nagasaki, correct? Right. And so it's interesting to me how little attention this gets now, right? There was a time I felt like in the 20th century, this anniversary was paid a little bit more national media attention. There was a little bit more educational attention that went with it. Now it's, it's like marking a big moment in the Civil War, right? It just
Right.
doesn't happen anymore.
Right.
And you've always been trying to essentially, hey, let's not forget this. And we've not, and I guess this gets it to, we spent a lot of time on covering the decision to launch and the decision to use. We've never focused on the fallout,
Yeah.
right? Is that because
In
it's
the
just
literal fallout or the
literal? I mean, in
other
the literal fallout.
Yeah.
And this to me is what you've always been trying to do. Like, shouldn't we understand the consequences of our actions and what
Yeah.
it did?
Well, again, a part of this film is the fact that the um, soldiers who went in. I mean, the entire issue of the occupation of Japan gets far, far, far less attention than Europe. The occupation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki get even less. You try to think back how many books or films you've seen about the occupation of Japan, or specifically the atomic cities. So it's that from the get-go, it's kind of an interesting subject to me. And then, of course, we sent in hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Hiroshima and Nagasaki within several weeks of the use of the bomb, or a month. What happened to them? They're in this.
Do we have a record
city.
of this? What is
Yeah,
their
well,
health record?
they did studies that allegedly showed that although radiation was elevated, it was not dangerous. But of course, we saw that throughout the 40s and the 50s and 60s with atomic tests in Nevada. Soldiers told, no problem, you can march under the mushroom cloud. All the atomic tests, all the atomic experiments that were held. So it's in the same vein of assuring people based on very quick and maybe not the best studies. And in fact, some of the servicemen in Nagasaki were sent out with radiation badges, and they felt they didn't work, or they never knew what they found. So that's, although the film focuses and the book focuses on the football game in the middle, there's a lot of build up to the soldiers, U.S. military who were there, and then afterwards, and a lot of them claiming health defects. There's one person I focus on who was the public address announcer for the game, who was one of those atomic soldiers who later filed claims and had cancer and so forth, and among the many who claimed that they were affected by exposure to fallout, exposure to radiation.
We've had quite a few votes in Congress to help compensate 9/11 first responders. Yeah. What has been the government's response? What was the government's response in the 60s and 70s when these health?
It took decades to recognize that this was even a valid issue. We got into the 1980s, and finally, the so-called atomic veterans, which included the Hiroshima and Nagasaki veterans, filed claims and got media attention about these claims, along with what we now call the downwinders, who lived in the path of the dozens of U.S. tests in Nevada, kind of lumped together. And so eventually, as the film shows, late 90s, there finally was a bill passed where these people would potentially get compensation if they could sort of prove, or suggest have some evidence that their cancer may have been caused by the exposure. And of course, by then, most of the veterans from Hiroshima and Nagasaki were already dead. And but even that was one of the few what I would say real positives that came out of the Oppenheimer film, was it drew more attention to the downwinders, who were many of them are still alive. And in fact, there was bills
Some
passed.
of them were young kids, right, that lived at Los Alamos with their parents who were working on the bomb, right?
Yeah. So there has been some action in Congress for compensation. I think even in the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, there's a provision.
Isn't that the Josh Hawley thing? Isn't that what he fought for?
So there'd be some money to the survivors in the U.S. The downwinders for what they went through mainly in the 1950s. So, but the veterans of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not get much out of their what happened to them there.
Why do you think has the Japanese government ever asked for compensation?
You mean for any explosion? I think they did years ago. You mentioned at the start, and it's certainly true. The Japanese, like the U.S., wanted to turn the page
Yeah.
uh, on World War II, and specifically the atomic bombings. Japan certainly had a lot to answer for, and it was certainly in their interest to look ahead and not back. So Nagasaki, particularly the Catholic nature of Nagasaki, led them to not be as vocal as Hiroshima in the decades ahead. So Hiroshima became the
Wow,
place.
because Nagasaki had a minority religious group,
It
it
was
was
large,
easier for
though.
the
Large
Japanese.
minority. Yeah.
I understand
Yeah,
that, but the Japanese political leadership felt it was okay to not worry about them.
well, it was partly the Catholic the influential bishops in Nagasaki were they. I don't know how much they really were sincere about it, but they
Hmm.
almost went, well, Nagasaki has paid for the sins of Japan in the
Huh.
war. And so it's almost like we're martyrs. And so we accept that. And it's kind of, I don't know if it's a Catholic thing to do, but it's to
Hmm.
be, say, okay, we were victimized by this, but it's actually was a good result that, the war ended or whatever. So, but there was a lot of that in my film. Um, the as you mentioned, the leading observer, kind of the hero of the film, who was the only one who offered firsthand accounts
Right.
of the game, which I received from one of his daughters and
Yeah.
photos given to him by the Japanese journalist who covered it for Japanese newspapers. The Japanese reporter's story was very bland, and wouldn't use any of his photos. So there was the same sense in Japan as in the US.
Yeah.
Like, okay, this happened. Let's let's bury it.
Yeah.
It happened, and let's move on. Because the message, and again, that's a lot of people. There may, from what I hear, there's a lot of people who may even support the use of the atomic bomb over at Nagasaki. But this story really shocks and uh, gives them kind of a very sick feeling because of the game being played there and on a killing field and.
Well, that's the whole thing, the game. So, first of all, when did you find out? When did you discover this game took place? Did you know this early on in your travels, or is this something you came across sort of
You know,
over time as you got more interest, as you did more studies of
yes.
of these two bombings?
Well, as you said, it was hardly written about by anyone
Uh-huh.
for decades. And I came across, I think I maybe even mentioned it in one or two books just in passing, because so little was known about it.
Uh-huh.
What was known basically was that the two stars were both, I mean, to show you the level of this, were
Hmm.
quite famous. The
At the
one
time, right?
captain, yeah, one captain was Angelo Bertelli, who had just won the Heisman Award, the best college player at Notre Dame of all places.
And back then, college football bigger than pro football. So
Yeah,
if you were the
absolutely.
Heisman Trophy winner
That's right.
in college football, you
Quarterback.
were the most famous football player in America.
Notre Dame quarterback,
Yeah,
later member of the College Football Hall of Fame.
right.
The other captain, the other team was Bullet Bill Osmanski, who was a legendary Chicago Bears running back. He'd won a
Uh-huh.
rushing title. He's on three championships teams for the
Uh-huh.
Bears. And he was over there. Actually, it's kind of funny. He was part of the occupying force in Nagasaki as a dentist. That was his training. So,
Hmm.
his so they were the two captains, and then they had various stars on their teams.
It was
So,
like a barnstorming event. Like they got, hey, we need to do we're trying to a goodwill. Was it seen as
you know,
some sort of goodwill gesture?
well, I mean, that's an interesting point. Why did this happen? Now, they were not part of a barnstorming team. They hadn't played elsewhere. If they'd
Okay.
toured the if they'd toured the Pacific, and you'd say, well, this is their latest stop, and they got off the boat and played this game, but this was a one-off. And uh, so, I mean, there in the film and the book, I present various possible notions. One was that this was a way to, uh, first of all, to show the Japanese our way of life in a way. I have a clip in the film from what was once a very famous uh, short film shown to every American who occupied Japan,
Mm-hmm.
which was actually written by Theodore Geisel, who later became Dr. Seuss.
Dr.
So there's
Seuss. I
this
love
clip of
that.
this film. So then
Yeah.
he wrote this basically this film of indoctrinating the U.S. soldiers to come into Japan. The one thing you need to do is show them our way of life, show them the way we live and the way we act and so forth. So there was a lot of Americans, playing, trying to play sports or getting the Japanese engaged in sports and show them that
we were trying to westernize Japan at that point.
Absolutely. In fact, I have some things in the film about 3 months after the atomic bowl. The military sponsored a Miss Atomic Bomb beauty pageant.
Yeah,
and they had
this is the more stomach. If it could be more stomach churning, it's the fact that they had a beauty contest called Miss Atomic.
Right.
I mean, wow.
So, and for Japanese girls, and and some of them, I imagine most of them were widows, maybe. But anyway, so it was a beauty pageant in Nagasaki. That's all you can say. But so there was something. Let's show them now. Of course, baseball had been big in Japan for about 25 years, but they didn't know football. So this was sort of this is football. Here's another very American thing. I think there was a bit, someone was quoted as saying, we didn't want to celebrate the use of the bomb, but we also remembered that so many of our fellow soldiers, friends had died, and they were not able to be here. And so the game, in a way, was paid as a tribute to the fallen soldiers who didn't make it to Japan. And I think there's also
it wasn't meant for the Japanese, though. I got the impression that it was not intended for a Japanese audience. The game itself.
Well, it's hard to say because very few attended, obviously. Although there was I've never seen photos to prove it. I mean, we do have photos of a marching band. They had a Marine marching band there, but they had promised Japanese cheerleaders, Japanese girl cheerleaders, as they said. So they had planned. I don't know if it actually happened, but the plans for the game included recruiting Japanese girl cheerleaders for the game. So, but in terms of a Japanese audience, there were 1,500 or more soldiers that filled the bleachers, and very little evidence of Japanese in attendance. So it wasn't like, asking the Japanese. Maybe they were invited and very few attended. Yeah.
Was this something that Washington knew about? Was this or was this a sort of an idea that was conjured up by the commander in Nagasaki?
Yeah. Well, I don't have I couldn't get a paper trail on that. I got a paper trail on a lot of things. I've got the movie has footage and dozens of photos that have never been published before. They're found by my research team and deep in the archives. But in terms of an order coming from Washington, no, it came from the commander of the massive occupying forces in the Nagasaki region, So we don't know if the Pentagon ordered it. I doubt if Truman ordered it, but I don't know who had the brainstorm exactly to do this.
Did the players later in life reflect on it?
No, that's the thing. That's where you kind of have to speculate on why this ended up in a dark hole in history. The players. And I talked to the sons and daughters of several players.
You tracked down a lot?
Survived, tracked down people. None of them ever heard their father.
It was one of those stories that grandpa or dad didn't talk about.
I mean, they never talked to. They wouldn't have known if
you were telling them the story for the first time.
Well, not in most cases. They'd heard about it in some way.
Okay,
but one fellow I liked particularly was the son of Angelo Bertelli, who never heard one word from his father. His father lived till he was 80 or something like that. Never heard one word from him. And anyway, his son is just an interesting sidelight. Is Robert Bertelli, who changed his name to Bob Burt and was the founding drummer of Sonic Youth, the great influential rock group of the 1980s. So is Bob Burt still in touch with him?
By the way, Sonic Youth. I mean, I'm just saying, right? Who knows, right?
Yeah, he loves the film. He thinks it's fantastic. All the children I've talked to love the film. I was frankly a little nervous that they might say, well, in a way, are you criticizing the players, or the players who took part? And they're not getting that at all. They're outraged by the fact that they were forced to play in this
They were
game.
kind of used. They were props.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So I actually, the feedback from the children of the players and the
Yeah.
others who organized the game has been very, very positive.
Any official feedback from anybody at the Pentagon?
No, not really. Like I said, this is a kind of a dark story. I think, I mean, the film, I think, is very lively. It's 53 minutes, and the
Yeah,
book
I look.
and
I
the
think it's
book
a
is
good watch.
yeah, and the book is very concise. So it's not it's not doom and gloom in the sense that
Mhm.
every page is just dripping with horror. It's basically, it tells the story of the U.S. forces occupying and coming in, what they were doing, how it led to this game,
Right.
what happened in the game itself, which has never
Well,
been come out, what happened after the aftermath, what happened to some of the people, and then the final third is about what has happened in the U.S. with nuclear weapons and the dangers and threats and what it's and today, and the mass the killing of civilians and the wars today, and the coming of AI, and all these things that arguably the Nagasaki bomb has contributed uh, to what's happening today.
there's always been this thesis that if you have a memory of that, if the more visual the memory is of something like that, the less likely you'll want to repeat it. The
Right.
more you memory hole something, the more likely said
Yeah.
bad event may happen again, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason why the Holocaust is something we try to put on the front burner, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
we want to
Yeah.
make sure that as a society, as a civilization, we know the warning signs, and we don't we don't want something like that to happen again. And it is interesting that just look at how much effort is put into never forget,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
look at how much effort is putting into forgetting what happened in Japan.
Well, of course, unlike with the Holocaust, the U.S. was not the principal player in causing
Right.
that, or any player in it,
Right.
except not maybe trying to bomb the rail lines and things like that. Of
Right.
course, using the atomic bomb was our decision, so
Right.
it is that's understandable in that. But
Yeah.
you mentioned the visuals, and I think that was a real turning point for me. And the value of going to Hiroshima and Nagasaki was, you get up there,
Sure.
you stand on a hill, and you look down, and you can look at the modern city and still, okay, from there to
You
there
see the wound, don't you?
was
You
what
can,
was wiped out with one
yeah.
bomb. And then you also recognize that the hydrogen bomb was 1,000 times greater.
Yeah.
And so it helps you imagine Boston or New York City or Chicago just completely wiped out by one bomb. But when you see it in person, looking down at a valley or a bowl,
Yeah.
knowing that it was completely wiped out deliberately with one bomb, it's something you do remember, 40 years later, in my case.
Have you connected with Japanese peers, that are historians that have
Yeah.
dug into this, and um is is there a robust sort of community that continues to want to write about what happened there, or is that sort of under the rug? Is there not a big community of Japanese authors and historians that focus on?
I mean, there's always been a community. I don't think it's very robust, and hasn't been. I mean, my previous book and film, which was called Atomic Cover Up, which you could also find on PBS, um, was just translated last year into Japanese. There was some need to cover this, to have my book translated into Japanese. So that may indicate something. But as you said, I think the Japanese, at least the elites there in the media, they also I mean, they cover this, especially the anniversaries. It's not
Right.
that they don't cover it and haven't covered it, but the issue was covered up by the U.S. For so many decades, for film footage and other things, and the Japanese kind of then had to catch up.
Who monitors the health? Does the Japanese monitor the health of those two cities to this day? Does it monitor radiation levels? Is it
Yeah.
still an issue? I mean, we've been told the half-life of this stuff is millions and millions of years. I mean, would you live in Hiroshima or Nagasaki today? Would you drink the drinking water?
Yeah, no, well, yeah, good question. But no, they monitored it. They monitored it pretty closely for decades, and I think they still do. They had some sort of report just last week, a report how many survivors there are now. They're sort of counting how many are still alive from them, and they've tracked them, and of course their children, and birth defects and things like that. So I can say they tracked it, but I mean, I wanted to mention one other thing when I'm talking about things that have come out recently, was that there was a very interesting poll last week from Pew survey. In the past, the polls have always found that a majority, maybe a slim majority, but a majority of Americans have always supported the use of the bomb against Hiroshima. They never ask about Nagasaki. I've never seen a poll. So you've always had 54% or 51% or 58% or whatever. So Pew finally did a new poll last week, or released it last week, and it found that now it was down to pretty much an even split, around 35%, 30%, with 30% saying they don't have an opinion or they don't know. And then they broke it down to gender. Women much more opposed. Younger people much more opposed. So I don't know if we're reaching this generational point where the people are taking a fresh look, or have never taken a look at the atomic bombing, and so they they don't really have an opinion. They don't know about it. So
Greg, I'm going to make us feel young. Both you and I were born after those bombs were dropped.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So, and I wonder, does it become easier to tell our elders they were wrong after they're buried?
Well, the dominant narrative of Hiroshima has always been, and again, you could do a whole 3 separate programs on this, but it was like, that the bombs actually saved a million American lives, or
that's been the spin, right? That's always been the
definitely
spin.
It was definitely going to happen, and my father would have died, or my grandfather, or whatever. And it's very understandable, and certainly a factor that has to be considered. On the other hand, there's a lot of reasons to counter that, but the fact is that a great deal of the narrative has been this personal family history almost. And now, of course, that's ending. And I'm going to say you have a clean slate, but it's much easier to look at the evidence.
It's just I would call it a dispassionate slate, not necessarily clean slate, but you don't have your own. Because look, I heard this. I had a grandfather that served in Europe, and his brother was in the Pacific. And boy, the debate about which was the worst place to be at war in, what was the tougher assignment, would be a debate that they would have that I vaguely remember. I'm, going to sit here and not. But, it is interesting to me that even in my own family, the European theater was if it was talked about our families who served, it was always on the European side. The Pacific side was always and the Pacific,
Yeah. Well, how many listeners out there have ever heard a story of a relative or anyone else who was in occupied Japan, or was specifically in Hiroshima or Nagasaki? There were hundreds of thousands of there. Why haven't we heard their story? Why, my film is a revelation for so many. Why is it such a revelation? Why is it? Oh yeah, we occupied those 2 cities. Well, I guess we had to. I didn't know that. And why were the soldiers allowed to go into those cities so quickly after the bomb? And then, of course, why would they have a football game, on Nagasaki? But, the fact that this seems like a really fresh, new, untold story, that's kind of more shocking than anything after 80 years,
But you pointed out the key factor here. This was, when do we have less information about our own history, when our own government, when it's a potential criticism of our own government's decision making, right? Yeah. Like those things, I have a feeling we're going to continue to discover more things about our decision making on the Vietnam War for another 20 years, because so much gets suppressed, and because there's an embarrassment level, right? There's all sorts of reasons, for that. And so I think now, with some distance, you certainly, I think, and this is what's difficult as an historian, you don't know for sure, all because so little there was so little firsthand account, right? We don't know
Right.
why they buried it, but we can speculate as to why.
Well, you just anything that's buried, you have to ask why. It's sort of like
Yeah.
if it was such a clear-cut decision, if it was such, if it really was the only thing that could end the war, et cetera, well, why not
Mm-hmm.
have it wide open?
Yeah.
But so yeah, I get suspicious when anything gets buried. I get whether it's any subject.
Mm-hmm.
You say, well, why was it buried? Why was it hidden if it's such a if it's it was such a good thing?
We're
So
talking on August 5th, and one of the interesting headlines of the day that caught my eye before I was interviewing you was the acting administrator of NASA, because, of course, in the Trump administration,
we
everybody
got
has
nuclear
multiple.
reactor on the moon. Is that
Yeah, nuclear reactor on the moon. What's your initial reaction to a reactor on the moon?
Well, number one, I probably won't live to see it. So there's that. I guess that's a positive.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's enough debate over nuclear power plants in the U.S. Dangers of nuclear power plants in the U.S. The nuclear waste that's still out there buried around the U.S. So there's plenty of those things to worry about. So I don't know, a nuclear reactor on the moon. I guess it's a good warning and symbol.
What is the nuclear energy debate, right? It is clean, but but nobody wants the radioactive waste in their backyard.
Right.
Do you think the science just isn't there yet? And until we can figure out how to do this without creating the excess waste, that it might be too risky? I mean, you've spent a lot of time on this issue, so I know you're not a scientist first, but I am curious what you've learned over the years from the experts on this.
Well, it's just, and there is, I mean, the probably the leading argument now is, as you mentioned, clean, just in terms of, how do we combat global warming? Well, one way is to use more nuclear and less coal and other things. Okay. Now, of course, if you want to say use more nuclear, you should also be 1,000% in favor of more wind and more solar and so forth.
Absolutely.
So there's no consistency. Someone says we're going to do an all-out push in the U.S. and around the world to forestall this. So we are going to get a little more nuclear. We're going to have wind and solar. But of course,
you're describing Obama. That was Obama's actual policy, which is why he greenlit the first nuclear power plant to be built in 30 years, right? Yeah.
But there's no coherence. There's all the hypocrisy and everything else. So I would say, everyone loves nuclear power until there's a Chernobyl or a 3 Mile Island or a near miss.
Or Fukushima.
A near miss, something. Oh, we barely missed that. And, we may see that with AI now, as I mentioned, the lessons of Nagasaki include being more automated or having someone take over from the president in a way, in encouraging. AI supposedly it's in all the nuclear systems now, but supposedly it cannot launch a strike on its own like a rogue AI, but it will filter all the information to a president or a national security team. And that's very dangerous. And so, we'll see. But they say in the film, it kind of all started with Nagasaki. And so, we'll see what happens with AI in the future here.
I actually want to unpack a moment from the movie Oppenheimer, which is a moment that Kai Bird's book doesn't have a definitive answer to,
right,
and has been speculated upon. And I know you have an opinion on this, which is when Oppenheimer went to Truman to he didn't want to used, right? What was, what do you think was said in that Oval Office meeting?
Well, of course, it was after the bombing. Oppenheimer was already nervous about building bigger bombs. The hydrogen bomb was already discussed. I mean, people know the hydrogen bomb didn't appear right away, but it was already on the drawing board, you might say. Right. And so, the story was Truman went in, or Oppenheimer went in and wrung his hands and said, "I have blood on my hands."
Right.
There are various.
And Nixon supposedly says, "No, I have." Truman does.
Either Truman said almost nothing, or he waved a handkerchief and offered it to him. This is wildly different stories. So.
Well, that's what I mean. It's so different that you're like, was Truman an asshole? here,
Yeah.
or was he empathetic? Right? Like,
I think, Oppenheimer, as you know, from the film very well, Oppenheimer was a complex character, and I think he
uh-huh,
could feel different things after, especially after Nagasaki, which he was horrified by, which I also show in the film.
uh-huh,
Uh, that he could both feel kind of guilty and, what have we done, and also feel, well, I was pretty proud of what we did, and he kept being put on committees to help manage the bomb after, and he kind of happily served on them, and then he wasn't so happily serving on them, and
mm,
so he was a complex character. So I think sometimes you look for a single answer on
yeah,
Oppenheimer. That he was racked with guilt for the rest of his life,
yeah.
uh, or he was mainly proud of the scientific achievement and was
But
paying lip
it's
service.
possible both things could be true at the
That's
same
right.
time,
I think
depending
so
on the mood he was in. Right?
with him. Yeah, absolutely. So, um, but yeah, that's again, you could say it's symbolic, but as the film shows, Oppenheimer did with a lot of the scientists. Now, I've known this for years. This wasn't a new revelation, but they
Mm-hmm.
celebrated, as you see in Oppenheimer, they kind of celebrated after the Hiroshima bombing.
Because
Um,
it worked. That's
it
what they were
worked,
celebrating, right?
right?
They were that it
Right, and they
worked.
knew it
Yeah.
killed a lot of people, but they did. Then, of course, the footage came in, taken from the air, showing the whole city wiped out. Oh, I guess a lot of civilians must have died. And then Nagasaki, which they really many of the scientists just said, "Oh my God, what this
What
is."
did you think of the portrayal? They That was a decision Nolan made, right? To I and you,
Not
I
show the
think,
victims, not show the victims.
correct.
Yeah.
You pointed this out first, and I thought it was a fair critique, and it is one of those, like, I understand he's making a movie. Okay, he's entered your and maybe you don't want to turn audiences off, maybe you don't want to make them sick to their stomach. I don't know, but that was a glaring missing piece.
Well, I showed at the time, um, and I still do a daily, somehow nearly daily free Substack newsletter.
I'm a
And you can
subscriber.
find,
You,
I'll,
by the way, you mostly lead with music, which I would think is
well,
fun.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay. But as I showed right away from there, because it rang a bell to me, there was a great series in the early 1980s on PBS called Oppenheimer. Sam
Mm-hmm,
Waterston played Oppenheimer. It was a
mm-hmm,
great series on PBS. And something I recalled from that was that in that series in PBS, again, in a kind of a subtle way, they showed Oppenheimer in a screening room after
mm-hmm,
Hiroshima, watching the first footage from Hiroshima on the
mm-hmm,
ground, showing some victims and survivors. And it's a very quick scene, very tasteful. He's watching, and then they show a few seconds from what he's watching, and they show him getting kind of let's say stricken by what he's watching. And they
mm-hmm,
show a few more seconds from the screen, and they cut back to him, and so you kind of get it. At least it's a way to show
mm-hmm.
uh, 30 seconds of the survival of the victims. The exact same scene is in Oppenheimer, and he's in a screening room looking up at the screen, the same angle,
Mm-hmm.
people around him, and all it does is show uh, the actor seeming to express
Right.
surprise or shock. You never see what's on the screen at all. Now, some might say that was a more artistic choice,
Mm-hmm.
made the point, but he could have shown something there, for example, without anyone saying, "Oh my God, he's just
Mm-hmm.
focusing too much on the survivors." So, um, and even in my film, like I said, my film is not has footage of victims and of
Mm-hmm.
survivors mainly, but it's a very, very small part of the film. You see it; it's very powerful, but most of the focus is on the Americans, and that's been kind of from the beginning. I have focused on the American response. I have not focused so much on the decision,
Right.
not focused so much on the Japanese response or
Mm-hmm.
anything. It's really, what has the American response been? Because that's going to help dictate if we use the weapons again. What is the lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki today? Is there really a taboo? I would argue there isn't a taboo because the media and many historians have always supported the use of the bomb. So
Well,
why would there
because
be a taboo?
it was always, look, I mean, I think about how I felt like I was taught it. Well, we did
Yeah,
it because
yeah,
it would have taken, we didn't want another D-Day, like,
yeah.
a
Yep.
list of fatalities going onto the shores of Japan.
But there could be a scenario today. In fact, I don't know if it occurred to you, because I presume you're probably aware that the U.S. has had for many years now so-called nuclear bunker busting bombs.
Right.
And that's the big threat today, in a way, is that the U.S. so-called modernizing our arsenal and the Soviets, that you can make the bombs more usable, because it's not the idea, well, if we drop 10 bombs, it's going to be the end of the world.
Right.
Now they're being made more usable.
To
And it
be
certainly
quote
occurred to me,
precision. This
yeah,
idea that there's a precision or somehow
and small,
the
less,
the the phrase tactical nukes, right? I don't know if it exists, but
yeah,
we want to
yeah,
pretend that right
yeah.
now we claim that it does.
Right. But it certainly occurred to me, and I maybe just because of my obsession, when Trump used for the first time ever,
Hmm.
these 30,000-pound bunker busting conventional bombs
Right.
against Iran, 6 weeks ago now, right?
Hmm.
Always referred to as bunker busting. That if that hadn't worked, hadn't achieved what he wanted, uh, would he have considered using nuclear bunker busters, which would
Mm.
more powerful and
Right.
do, yeah, I mean, it's the same idea. It's bunker busting. It's not
Right.
mushroom cloud over a city. And
Right.
it certainly occurred to me, especially with Trump, you get frustrated. Iran doesn't back down. Maybe Iran's
Sure.
threatening to
And,
bomb,
and
to
he's a
attack
quick
U.S. Yeah, all it would take.
he's the quick
Iran
decider. Yeah.
attacks U.S. force. That was the big fear, right?
Right.
Iran attacks U.S. forces in the Middle East. Okay, that
Right.
doesn't really happen. But what if it did happen?
Right.
Trump say, "Well, I've got these nuclear bunker. I'll show them." So
Right.
that's I keep coming back to, is there a taboo on using nuclear weapons? Well, in 1945, we used two of them, and it was judged quite
Mhm.
positively. And then we even had a football game on a killing
We even
field
had a
4 months
football game.
later,
All
and
right.
this Nagasaki beauty pageant. So, I mean, is there a taboo on using nuclear
Yeah.
weapons against the cities?
Yeah.
Um, a fallout, as you mentioned, fallout and everything that would come from it. So, is there a taboo? I don't know. That's the
Well,
question.
look, I think you made to me, you know, you're you're a good educator in that you're like, okay, how do I get more people to pay attention to an issue that maybe
Yeah,
they're not paying attention to? Right? Huh. Why don't I get people to come in on this weird football game decision
yeah,
and
well,
maybe
yeah,
it'll get them to want to learn more. I mean,
right,
this is what I admire about your writing, about the way you go about things. You don't, you're not somebody that pounds your fist and says, you need to know this. You're like, all right, let me come up with another way to educate you.
no, well, yeah,
It's a
that's
nice gift that you have.
well. Well, I appreciate that, and I think you're probably correct. And this is the latest example, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I've kind of looked for, stories that illustrate, as opposed to this is why something's wrong, or
Right.
get on your
You
high
lead the
horse.
horse to water. You don't shove the
Oh,
water into the horse's mouth.
yeah, that's great. I hope so. I hope that's true.
Let me get you out of here on a question that I've been wanting to ask you. I could just email you or direct message you, but let me ask you here, which is, what do you think Upton Sinclair would be today? What would he? Is there somebody in the political culture today that most resembles him? Um, what kind of force do you think he would be politically if Upton Sinclair, were reincarnated in
Yeah.
2025?
Wow, that's a tough question, because you combine a writer and who's basically the people know about the job. Of course, there's probably 60% in your audience saying, "Well, who was
Who is
Upton
Upton
Sinclair?"
Sinclair? Wait, The Jungle.
Sinclair
You read?
Lewis.
Okay, yeah,
No, he's Sinclair Lewis. Is that
right.
he's Sinclair Lewis? He wrote
Yes.
Elmer Gantry and so. Uh, but Upton Sinclair, in a nutshell, became a very famous writer. He was a socialist. He was a social activist.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and then he ran for office in this, as you mentioned, this incredible campaign. So it's hard to think of someone who combines all those things today. It's
Hmm.
like he was even to the left of Bernie Sanders, if you want to say.
Yeah.
He's a mix of Bernie Sanders and
Yeah.
whatever. I don't know who a famous novelist would be who's pretty far left, who is also getting arrested in demonstrations. I mean, he was
Right. That doesn't really exist anymore, does it?
yeah,
Like
it's
that. That.
kind of a
Yeah.
one-off, but
I guess he was kind
um,
of a journalist in his own right back
yeah,
then. I mean, that's
yeah,
the way
yeah.
journalists. I mean, I'm interested in
Pamphlet
that.
here,
Greg, I'm obsessed with that period because I think we're reliving it. right? I think the era that Upton Sinclair, his formative years are now our formative years, right? You had sort of Gilded Age. You had sort of a transition from the agrarian economy to the industrial economy, and what was happening to the labor force and what was happening to people, and sort of, and here we are again, and this is a different sort of moment, but in a similar moment. And oh, by the way, we also had a media that wasn't very trustworthy back then, right? A lot of partisan media. Well, we have we have the same sort of infrastructure today.
Yeah,
that's why I just think that it's my way of plugging that book and just Upton Sinclair in general, because I do think, as you know better than most, right? We know history doesn't repeat, but it sure runs.
Yeah, right. That's right. Well, let's hope we're not heading into another Great Depression, and there'll be even more. Although maybe we'd get a candidate like Upton Sinclair who would run.
Well, I mean, that would be my, well, in many ways, right? Some of the look, it takes. Well, I think we know it takes sort of. I always say the voters eventually get it right, but sometimes they just need more time to figure it out.
Well, or get exposed to things. I think that's the biggest. And you know all about this. Yeah, do people have an open mind? Can they even be reached? And that's my biggest fear. You can always say there are cycles. Did anyone see Obama coming? Or even when Bill Clinton got elected, it was like, wow, this Arkansas governor, I couldn't imagine him getting elected.
Right.
So funny things happen. Of course, when Trump was elected, it was not expected. So unexpected things can happen, but is our landscape so different today that so few people are really open to opposing views?
Well, that's or have we
old fact?
Well, and the algorithmic influences, right? Is there any? My biggest complaint today is that you and I don't control any distribution of information. It's 5 tech companies do.
Yeah. No,
are they even gonna know that you wrote this book? Are they gonna know that you made this documentary? Right? Like, unfortunately, that's an open question now. And that, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have said that.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate any talking about this. So I appreciate it.
I know you do.
You had me on, and there'll be some people out there who say, interesting. I'm going to look into this.
Yeah. I will tell you this: you're a great follow on Substack. You're if you want to get a more of a taste of the Greg Mitchell brain, definitely subscribe to his Substack.
Let me just mention that the film is, besides showing on PBS stations.
Yep.
Not every PBS station, but it's streaming. It's streaming on PBS, and you can just go to pbs.org. It's on all the PBS apps. The people who have the
I have an app. You just go and it's there.
You don't have to check for your local list. You can check your local list, but you can watch it.
You just search Atomic Bowl on the PBS app. If you have that on your Apple TV, and
so anyone out there can watch it today if they care, buy the book or whatever. But it's out for everyone. It's not something you have to look for popping up next week or next month.
Well, this is the 80th anniversary. Right?
No, that's right. Yep.
So here we are. Greg Mitchell, congrats. Great to talk with you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Chuck.